Much for coming. It is our honor to once again welcome Dr. Wael Hallaq for the first and was going to be a series of lectures. Today's lecture is What is Sharia, the Ethical Structure? And in a few weeks, he'll be giving us another lecture on what is Sharia, the primacy of the human. For those of you who are not aware of Dr. Hallaq's work, where have you been? But I'll also give you an introduction. So Wael Hallaq is the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University, where he's been teaching ethics, law, and political thought since 2009. His teaching and research cover the intellectual history of Orientalism and the way it captures the problematics of modernity. His work also deals with the synchronic and diachronic development of Islamic traditions of logic, legal theory, and substantive law, and has explored the structural dynamics of legal change in pre-modern law. And I would add here that one of the things that Dr. Hallaq brings to his studies that few other people bring is the manner in which you can situate with Islamic law within the entire kind of cognitive hierarchy and the cognitive cartography of classical Islam. That is, how is it related to all of the other disciplines, and how do those disciplines work together in a harmonious manner for the function of society and Islamic intellectual culture. Now, for the past decade and a half, Dr. Hallaq's work has increasingly focused on the critique project, including the paradigmatic structures of knowledge that drive it, as well as the relationship between governance and ethics. And these are these three books that you see right here. His current research attempts to map the constitutional practices of Islamic governance between the 8th and 18th centuries, with a view, among other things, to constructing a heuristic for a critique of modern constitutional arrangements. Professor Hallaq's work over the last 4 decades has established him as a leader in the field, and he has produced numerous books and dozens of peer-reviewed articles. It is widely debated, his work that is widely debated in academia, as well as on social media and mass media. And his books and articles have been translated into over a dozen languages. He is the recipient of many prestigious awards, including honorary membership in research and science foundations, and he is also a very fine human being, I would add. So without further ado, please, Dr. Hallaq.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Set that up, and there's water for you.
Thank you. No, very good. No, this is fine. This is fine. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me well? I'm delighted to be here.
Can you just move a little bit to the mic?
I'm delighted to be here. Is it good?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. If you don't like it at any point of time, just let me know. It's good to come and see old friends again and make new ones. I want to thank the College of Islamic Studies, Dean Shinturk, who's not here tonight. I suppose he's traveling. The all too kind presentation of my good colleague Joseph Lombard, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to start with this lecture as part of a 3-part series. The first would be deal with the ethical. The second with the human as a concept in the law, and the third, the political. These are going to happen every Monday, next Monday and Monday after, at the same time here, right? Is that same venue? So in this series of 3 lectures, I would like to simultaneously accomplish 2 things that seem difficult to do. One is to provide for the beginner a general account of what the Sharia was, without imposing a heavy analytical framework. The other is more complex and intellectually demanding. So I'm going to try to navigate at two levels. For those who don't catch the drift of some of the theoretical stuff, just ignore it. Try to understand what you can understand. This was hard work for me, so I hope it will be successful. I've never tried it before, but hopefully it will work. I would like to center our gaze on three aspects of the Sharia that are both historical and contemporary. What I mean by historical and contemporary is that in addition to the supposedly intrinsic value of studying the Sharia for its own sake, if that is possible at all, to be honest with you, I don't believe in intrinsic interest. There is always something behind people's interest in something. There is no such thing as studying something just for the sake of that thing, without anything with regard to the reader, to the observer, to the researcher. So, what I mean by the historical and contemporary is that in addition to the study of the Sharia for itself, there is a general great benefit in reflecting on how bygone experiences of the humankind can shed light on our own age, on the problems we are facing in this modern era. It is therefore to be understood that my premises and presuppositions reject the fundamentals of the theory, or rather the theology of progress, and refuse to see the past as primitive or even irrelevant. History is much more complicated than such a simplistic narrative. The exercise offered in these lectures, I must add, is not only historical in the sense of claiming authenticity and going back to our heritage or our history because it belongs to us. It is also an exercise in epistemology, which is to say that it is an exercise in comparison and contrast, two essential tools of understanding and of true cognitive appreciation. Comparison and contrast have the power to reveal and to expose, to pin down the foundations and true nature of things. I can never know what big means unless I see small. Nor will I understand what quenching really means if I did not go thirsty. And so the study of Sharia and its history has the power of telling us about what may be missing in our world, about how another society, which lived a full life, so to speak, experienced the world in a way that leads us to asking interesting questions about our own modes of living. So what I'm suggesting is that the past remains an essential source of the kind of knowledge we nowadays need, although I fully recognize that institutionally and materially, it is largely irrecoverable. Ma fata mat is true to a great extent, but not entirely. And if we employ the method of contrast and comparison, then we begin to engage in critique for the method of comparison, especially systemic and macro comparison is essential for critique. Thank you. The other point I want to score before we embark on our series is that critique should be distinguished from criticism. To criticize is to fulfill the common academic practice of writing book reviews and reports for periodicals about whether articles and essays should be published or not, whether they meet the internal criteria of the discipline. Criticism is mostly a routine professional activity whose aim is to strengthen a particular field of study, or generally the existing system of knowledge. Criticism is conservative in the sense that it aims to conserve the system in which it functions. Critique, however, is structural and foundationalist in the sense that it questions the fundamental premises of a system. It asks questions about the validity and invalidity and viability and unviability of a system, and aims to suggest solution to upend and overhaul that system. We therefore have here two entirely different methods of evaluation, which people confuse. One is conservative and one is not. One deals with detailed and restricted fields of knowledge, specialized field of knowledge, which we call disciplines, and one deals with systems. That is, one deals with individual trees, while the other deals with the entire forest. Critique is systematic because meaning actually critique is also systemic, not systematic only, but systemic, because it is an epistemological act, an epistemological tool that is set in motion in times of crisis. Criticism functions well in ordinary times, when everything is going well. When things are assumed to be stable, critique specializes in emergencies and becomes increasingly intense as the emergencies, or should I say crises, become more critically dangerous and threatening. A standard dictionary defines crisis as, quote, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. End of quote. It is also, the lexical definition continues, quote, the turning point of a disease when an important change takes place. End of quote, at times leading to death. In Middle English, crisis denotes, quote, the turning point of a disease. Crisis means the turning point of a disease. End of quote. When, in other words, a decisive point is reached. That is, a deciding point when things go wrong in profound and fundamental ways. Hailing from Greek word krino, crisis originally meant a decision, a judgment about a tipping point, when things go haywire. Finally, I want to argue, and hopefully I don't need to rehearse for you any evidence, that our world has reached this point, likely a point of no return. I hope not, but it looks like it. We are squarely in the midst of crisis, in the heart of it, and sunk in it knee deep. We have destroyed our environment and its ecology. We have destroyed our communal and familial fabric. And we have destroyed our inner psyche. Every word here that I am mentioning to you, I can document with books and pages of numbers and statistics. So I hope nobody will question these issues. We have destroyed everything natural we have touched. And if there is anything that we have built that is worthwhile, it is dedicated entirely, notice, to ameliorate, but not truly solve the harshness of the destruction, to normalize it, and when not normalize it, make it palatable. It is these premises that constitute the foundations of my 3 lectures. I want you to keep them in mind, please. I will ask you to keep them in mind all the time while I engage with Islamic history. And of course, I am happy to entertain questions about them at the end of the lecture or the lectures, because I'm fully aware that some happy modernists will not accept them at face value. So I'm ready for battle. Generally speaking, I do not think it an overstatement to argue that the Sharia in its classical form, that is before the 18th or early 19th century, the 1826 is a key year. So when I speak about the Sharia before modernity, I mean anything before 1826. This story is long and complicated. I will not go into it tonight unless you really insist. But that's my periodization. So generally speaking, I don't think it an overstatement to argue that the Sharia in its classical form represented a complex set of social, economic, cultural, and moral relations. Relations, I may add, that permeated the epistemic structure of the social and political orders. When I mention the moral alongside the economic, social, and cultural, I do not mean to separate them as distinct members, but to the contrary, to indicate their interconnectedness, even their overlappings. The Sharia was then a discursive practice in which these relations intersected each other, acted upon each other, and affected each other in countless ways. This discursive practice involved institutions operating upon, resisting, or enhancing each other. It involved writing, studying, teaching, and documenting. It involved a political representation in the name of the law, and a strategy of resistance against political and other abuses. It involved the cultural rendering of law in practice, where cultural categories meshed into fiqh, legal procedure, social moral codes, and much else. It involved a moral community which law in its operation could not but presuppose, for it is a truism, as I will discuss, that the Sharia itself was constructed on the assumption that its audience and consumers were all along moral communities. It involved an intellectual system in which the jurists and the members of the legal profession were educators, writers, and thinkers who, on the one hand, were also historians, theologians, men of letters, and the chemists, physicians, and the astronomers, while on the other, men of ideas who contributed to the ongoing, forging of a complex set of relations that at times created or conduced in the creation of political truth and ideology, while at other times confronting power with its own truth. It involved the regulation of agricultural and mercantile economies that constituted the vehicle for the maintenance of material and cultural lives that spanned the entire gamut of classes and social strata. It involved the theological substrate that colored and directed much of the worldview of the population, whose inner spiritual lives and relationships were in daily touch with the law. The theological substrate encompassed the mundanely mystical, the esoterically philosophical, and so it created complex relations between the Sharia and the larger spiritual and intellectual orders in which and alongside which it lived and functioned. The Sharia then was not only a judicial system and a legal doctrine. That's what we need to understand. Many people think, well, it's you have law, a legal system, and the Sharia was the equivalent. It was not like that at all. It was not just a legal doctrine whose function was to regulate social relations and resolve disputes, but a discursive practice that structurally and organically tied itself to the world around it in ways that were vertical and horizontal, structural and linear, economic and social, moral and ethical, intellectual and spiritual, epistemic and cultural, literary and textual and poetic, and so on and so forth. And again, every word here, one can write a few paragraphs just to explain what the poetic means, for example. How come that the Sharia is so poetic? Well, there are so many ways of explaining this, one of which probably familiar to some of you, that almost every fiqh was put in poetry, right? Just as to show you the connections between the literary word and the Shari'i word, not to mention the linguistic and the philosophical linguistic world with the Sharia, which is the basis of something called usul al-fiqh, which many of you know. It's a majestic discipline of first order caliber, intellectual caliber. Difficult to understand. I'm insisting on all these aspects in order to underscore the point that the ethical and the moral are not segregated entities, but rather constitute an essential substrate of all aspects of life and living. That when dead,
It's already off, so we're just gonna turn it
I
on.
swear I didn't touch it.
It's okay.
The moral and ethical represent the warp that is woven into the woof of life, of economics, social relations, political conduct, and so much else. This amounts to an argument that I will continue to insist on, that it is in the nature of Islamic paradigmatic structures that facts are never separate from value, that all facts are ultimately saturated with value. And so I would like to argue that there are at least three central ways in which we can answer this question. What is Sharia? The first is the linkage between the concerns of law as a regulating power and force on the one hand, and ethics and morality on the other. The second is the concept of the human in the Sharia. Or to put it into a question form, how does the Sharia view and thus treat the human? And to make sense of this question, we must compare and contrast it with our modern law and the way it approaches the subject of the human. And the third addresses the connections and relations between law and politics. Of course, there are other ways of engaging other ways of engagement that unravel what the Sharia was. But these, I believe, are among the most central. My general argument is that the Sharia is an ethical and moral system first, and a legal concept, a legal technique, and a legal system second. But let me flesh this proposition out in stages. First, no one will disagree with me, I believe, if I start with the Quran as the bedrock on which so much of Muslim culture throughout history rested. The language of the Quran is at once moral and factual. Now, I should say, which I took for granted when I was writing my lecture, is that probably now some of you will say, why is he insisting so much on the ethical? It's because I'm fighting basically a whole group of armies, not one army, a group of armies in many places who are insisting on the fact that the Sharia and Islam do make distinctions between fact and value, and that this is embedded in the Sharia. Because the stakes riding on this issue are huge. If you give one answer to this or another, it changes your entire way of approaching, even of living in the world. To say that there is a distinction between fact and value in Islam means that you belong to a particular camp of thinkers. Not only that, you belong to a kind of person who lives in the world in a particular way. But if you don't accept this and you say, no, Islam has always been, as I will show, and this is why I think I begin with the Quran, because it is the most irrefutable source of documentation and proof. Because we all know that the jurists took it very seriously. Then your view of the world and the universe becomes a totally different view. The way you live in it, the way you deal with the world, with your fellow humans, with everything around you, becomes different. So when I keep working on this distinction between fact and value, or between ethics and other things, meaning ethics and everything else, we are talking about fundamental philosophical issues that actually mushroom or have applicable and practical ramifications that can affect the way we live. Now, to tell you another thing to show you how important it is, my argument is that because of the modern European separation between fact and value, we have managed to destroy everything we have touched, to put it briefly. So you see how important it is. So the language of the Quran is at once moral and factual, where morality and ethics are not to be dissociated from facts, including facts of nature. If mountains shake and volcanoes erupt, it is by dint of a moral agent who moves natural phenomena as responses to ethical or rather unethical behavior. This is the idea, first articulated to a fine point by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, that it is impossible for Hume, it's impossible to derive an ought from an is. So if you have a value, which ought, value means well, we should be doing this. This is wonderful, this is useful, this is good, this is bad. He said that you cannot derive an ought from an is. In other words, morality cannot be derived from actual natural facts. The fact that New York City has nearly 3 million people who suffer from poverty or who live below the poverty line is a fact that does not on its own allow the derivation of any moral judgment. And he's right about this. In New York, if you walk on Broadway around 42nd and say, well, there are 3 million poor people in New York. Okay, nice fact to know if you are a tourist and you don't know anything about New York. But that's it, that's the end of it. But it is impossible in Muslim majority societies to hear the word, for example, faqir or miskeen, poor or downtrodden, without invoking a deep sense of responsibility and duty to alleviate the hardship of these people. If I were to stand on a populated street in Cairo, Doha, or Casablanca, well, Doha, I'm not sure because there are so many foreigners here. So I cannot judge, I don't know. It's not like I am saying that they do or do not act in a particular way, I just don't know. Because I'm eager to speak Arabic on the street and I cannot find anybody to speak to. So maybe forget Doha for a second, all right? But Cairo, as much as it is wonderful to be in Doha, Arabic is becoming a problem for me. So if you were to go into these places, and I'm talking about actual experiences of my experiences in such places as for example Rabat in Morocco or Cairo or other places, and if you were to say out loud in a sense والفقراء والمساكين, just to say والفقراء والمساكين, which actually is not even a full sentence. Meaning the poor and the downtrodden. All you are saying is poor and downtrodden. Every rational adult will understand this to mean that the referents need assistance and support. The very mention of these words invokes, even summons a sense of duty to offer help, even to pay the alms tax as a duty. وفي أموالهم حق للسائل والمحروم, right? And I mean, this is a powerful, powerful language. Haqq. This power of combining fact and value is nothing but Quranic in origin. It is as if to say that there is an apodictic relationship, a necessary logical relationship between poverty and the duty to do good, to help, and to offer sustenance and support. This apodictic connection should not be surprising, given that the very creation of the humankind was not only an act of moral judgment, but one whose reason, cause, and origination have been for the sole purpose of doing good, the emblem of the moral. We have created life and death, and we have created Adam and Eve for the sole purpose of doing good. لِنَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. Again, strong Quranic. That's the challenge. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْحَيَاةَ وَالْمَوْتَ لِنَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. This is something that is foundational to the Quranic message. The world, with all the life created in it, is purposed for the doing of good. From the very beginning, the Quran provides a cosmology entirely grounded in moral natural laws. The Quranic moral arsenal was thus embedded in a holistic system of belief, in a cosmology that comprised a metaphysic. In fact, it may be argued that this cosmology was itself part of an enveloping moral system that transcended the categories of theology, of theosophy, and metaphysics. In this broadest sense of cosmology, we might argue that the Quran offers no less than a theory of moral cosmology of first order, a cosmology made up of a moral fiber. Everything that this universe contains was created for humans to enjoy, not in a utilitarian manner, but rather in ways that show deep moral accountability, translating into an acknowledgement that what we do for ourselves, certainly as individuals, but more importantly as members of a social group. Actions, therefore, have universal consequences despite our and their own ephemeral existence. The Quranic narrative of creation is single-mindedly geared toward laying down the foundations of moral cosmology. The heavens and the earth were brought into being according to the divine principle of truth and justice, haqq. As one surah announces, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ. Here, a strong conceptual connection is forged with the profoundly significant declaration made in the same surah 2 verses earlier, that the Quran itself was likewise revealed on account of the same principle of haqq. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ. These are not just words, passing words. Promptly followed by 39:4, هو الله الواحد القهار خلق السماوات والأرض بالحق. We are talking about architecture and engineering and design. This is how the world was created. These are not just simple words, simple language. We are talking about the way the universe was designed. The message of the Quran destined to a human society is therefore an extension, if not an integral part, of the entire project of creation, sanctioned, moreover, by the same rules and principles. The physical world of the Quran is therefore not a modernity-defined scientific site. It is not subject to cold and bland rational explanation. It is not a cosmic accident, but rather a world saturated with spirituality and psychology, one wholly subservient to moral actions taken by the very humans that were created by God. There is thus an inextricable organic and structural relationship between creation on the one hand and belief and good conduct on the other. If one entails the other, then there is also an immediate logical and epistemic connection, which is to say that the presence of belief demonstratively entails the presence of good works and vice versa. To believe in God as the sole sovereign is at once to accept a whole practical code of conduct. The reason why I start with the Quranic foundations is precisely because these are the foundations on which the entire world of the Sharia was based. Fundamental to this story is the fact that the Sharia was not just a legal system and an intellectual formation of first order. That it was. It was a culture that defined much of what Islam was, what Islam could be and could not be. But what was the nature of the connection between this culture and the cosmology that I have just talked about? I would like to argue that the nature of this connection is epistemoral. For those who don't know English very well, I'm going to reveal a secret that this is my creation, this word. I just invented this. It is epistemology, cut first half, and moral, so epistemoral. Now, it should be interesting that I have to coin a new term to convey to you a configuration of concepts that is not familiar to us. Our modern world, as I think is well known by now, is substantially fragmented, where morality and epistemology and logic and everything is segmented and fragmented. Where things seem to exist within a patchwork of inorganic relations. We have erected serious divisions between ways we live privately and ways we live politically, publicly. Something we naturalized and normalized under the rubric of secularism. We have ranked races into superior and inferior, as we can see, and we have seen intensely in the last 4 months. Creating a new concept and practice of genocide. We have sharpened the divide between women and men, and then between certain kinds of women and men. Think of the LGBTQ, which has expanded recently into, that's last time I checked, LGBTQQIP2SA. By my count, it's 10 numbers here. Don't ask me to tell you which one stands for what. Think of the divisions in academic fields. A crisis that gave rise in the 1980s to the need for the study of interdisciplinarity. But in my view, the most important division has been between the moral and everything else. So when I list all these divisions, they are just part of a long, bigger story. But the mother of all of them is the division between ethics, morality on the one side, and everything else, such as economics, such as medicine, such as even science, such everything, absolutely everything. For our concerns here, I want to emphasize the separation between epistemology and ethics, something that Muslims did not recognize. Of course, for Orientalism, the lack of distinctions in Islamic learning was always described as an absence, as a weakness, or worse, as a failure on the part of Muslims to recognize defined conceptual distinctions in and between concepts. In this case, between the ethical and the legal. A vice was converted into virtue by the sheer force of intellectual sovereignty. It is so because we said so. European knowledge, it was argued, makes such distinctions because the European mind possesses special analytical powers. They always have the superior powers of reason, as well as of democracy and everything else. And the last 4 months, again, I'm going to be repeating this sentence, last 4 months, 1 million times in the next 3 weeks. because it's like a whole host of scandals opened up. I argue that the distinction between epistemology and ethics was made because ethics was ousted from all other domains, leaving these domains to be delimited by a new materialist and instrumentalist ethic that is relative and highly subjective, creating what one sociologist called liquid modernity. My point is this, that from its beginning, and especially with and in the Quran, Islam viewed knowledge as being intrinsically ethical. Knowledge is ethics, and ethics is knowledge. Every proposition is an act, and every act is semiotics. That is a language. And any form of knowledge that does not lead to an ethical end, what Muslims used to call ilmun la yanfa', was not deemed a legitimate form of knowledge, even not knowledge at all. And so we can easily see how the Quran was seen as the venue, or if you will, the rope, hablullah, through which ilm, the knowledge of God, is dangled, so to speak, to the humankind. The fiqh of the Sharia was to imbibe fully the epistemological principles that this rope conveyed. It is profoundly important to look at the origins of legal knowledge in Islam in contradistinction with the modern modalities of establishing knowledge genealogies. The principle that individual human agency is the only means to establish a representation of God's moral intentions was in fact Quranic. But what does this mean? It means that only pious, learned, but also believing individual Muslims can attempt or can engage the project of unveiling God's moral intentions. These intentions were coded in the Quran and shrouded with clear language, but also with intimations and semiotic signs. Isharat, ima'at, dalalat, all sorts of things that were hotly debated. These signs being an integral part of the ethical challenge that God installed in the design of human and world creation. It's in a sense, the very act of creation, especially creating the human, was in a sense designing one of the most intricate challenge games ever. If you read the Quran, it is in a sense, it is so much about challenging the human to rise to an ethical benchmark. The elaboration of the science of legal signs, that is of God's moral law, was given in Islam the name of usul al-fiqh. Most of the work happened there. Not all of it, but most of it happened there. A science that established first-order hermeneutical principles in order to discover the architecture of the moral will. This science, whether descriptive or prescriptive, gave Islam its constitution of legal reasoning, which for us in this context means equally moral reasoning. And if this is the case, then we might as well immediately draw a political conclusion of first order. That the law that regulated political life in Islam is fundamentally different from the law that regulates life under the modern state. It is a moral law whose motives and origins emanate from a compassionate source, one that speaks the language of the poor and the needy, the downtrodden and the weak. It is a law that is at once cosmic and metaphysical, mystic and personal. Politics, the state, and the political, and whatever other designations we may care to conjure, are all under this higher law. And so there is here no paradox of sovereignty, no issues to be solved as to which derives from which, law or politics. This is a huge, huge debate in Western political thought. Is law the foundation of the state, or is the politics on power of the state is the foundation of the law? And they haven't solved it yet. They have been debating it for about a century without any solution. But of course, the answer is between us, it's very easy. I'll tell you about it later if you want. The modern state, and ample evidence has shown in the last century, is the master above all masters, the God of the law and of man. Nothing is higher than the state, whether in authority, force, or violence. While the state and its law know only themselves as the highest power, the moral law of Islam enshrines itself in the name of a God whose interests stand in an identity with what we nowadays call the people, the poor and the needy, and with the weak and the unprivileged. If I were to summarize the so-called rights of God, huququllah, in the Sharia with a broad brush, I would say that God's rights are mostly certain types of protections accorded to the weak and the marginalized segments of the social order. But as importantly, these egalitarian and compassionate laws are not subject to man's whims of legal reasoning that can easily slide into instrumental and subjective forms, leading, as we have seen in our modernity, to disastrous effects. The rights of God are fixed, and so the poor, as deserving of protection, will continue to have these protections as long as the Sharia survives in the world. No human being has the power to change these eternally fixed principles, however much practical flexibility these principles may possess in their applications. So it should not surprise us, therefore, that one of the 5 pillars on which Islam rests is almsgiving, zakah, a principle of economic protection for the poor and the needy that give rise to an expansive system of charity that came to define the entirety of the culture and civilization. The moral thrust of the pillar, however, is no different from the other 4 pillars: to give away your wealth. Is this again? Is it okay now? Thank you. To give away your wealth for the benefit of others is not a one-time act, but an enshrined principle of action, in effect a praxis. It is, in other words, a technique, a self-conscious technique of moral improvement, of ethical cultivation. From this perspective, giving alms is not different from the practice of praying or fasting, or, for that matter, from studying and researching and writing. All of these are ethical operations of the self on the self, in a deliberate and self-conscious manner, in order to produce particular ethical formations in the subject. This is why intention, niyyah, and belief, iman, are essential for the entire project, for without them, the teleology of the law will never attain realization. All of this, by the way, I'm mentioning all these things which seem sometimes basic, but they are actually profound in the sense to prove the case of the relationship between ethics and fact. Without niyyah, there is no coherent ethical practice. This explains the order of law books in the Islamic tradition, the so-called fiqh works. The 5 pillars of Islam are foundational, standing apart as the bedrock of the religion, which is to say that they are exclusivist in the sense that everything else is both subsidiary and subordinated to them. If these are the pillars, then everything else is not. But since the Sharia must, by necessity, regulate all human behavior, then that which is not a pillar must conform to the pillars, dictate and aggregate well. Which is to say that the structure and operation of the pillaric system predetermines both the subject and subjectivity, meaning the person and his or her inner self and makeup, preparing them to embark upon that which lies in the non-pillaric world. And the pillars, accurately reflecting the Quranic tenor, are anchored in a simple message. understand your place in the world, understand your own transience, understand that you are created as part of a community and of a family that feeds your soul. A plant and grain feed, as plant and grain feed your body. Understand that all this is a gift that comes with a responsibility towards everything around you. Understand that you really own nothing, that you will unavoidably face your end, and that you will take nothing with you to the grave except your good deeds. Your name, your good name, hopefully. Understand that you have duties towards the world in which you are created, toward the community that was created for you, and that is your anchor. Take nothing for granted. Notice here how the issues of belief and basic values are tied to economics, to ways of living, to your obligations towards everything is interconnected in ethical ways. Now, there is no law in the modern state that will tell you, you have to understand these things, that you are actually a transient being, you are nothing. You better remember this all your life because it will affect the way you deal with the world and live in the world. So if I tell you that all of this theology is highly environmentalist, you will understand what I mean by that. So it is this foundational understanding that underlies a set of performative acts and utterances which have a cumulative shaping effect on the soul and the mind. In their entirety, these acts are private, internal, and thus affective. From prayer and fasting, which both locate themselves in that foundational understanding, to pilgrimage and almsgiving, the total effects of these acts shape the Muslim subject. The desideratum of the Sharia and of Islamic governance, and therefore of the art of living itself. The rest of Sharia laws and rules presuppose such an object and stand in one strong sense as the addendum and annotation of this morally formed subject. In other words, it is not a coincidence that the 5 chapters of all law books of fiqh, and they always must be first, deal with prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and alms tax. Together with the Shahada, the creedal foundations, as a foundation, they constitute the ethical subject matter before the subject embarks on the journey of encountering the law in his or her life. Even before reading the rest of the chapters. You cannot understand the works of fiqh without these first 5 in so many ways. You cannot understand the whole fiqh without understanding what it means to have a particular community with a particular moral constitution. It's impossible to understand the fiqh itself unless you know this dimension about Islamic society. There's no legal subject we can navigate the Sharia, who can navigate the Sharia as a legal system without this moral preparation, without this moral instruction. On a general scale, almost universal in character, the idea of the inseparability of law and ethics may be found to be quite robust. Many of us are already familiar with the so-called 5 universals, the al-Kulliyat al-Khams, according to which the Sharia legal system and therefore Islamic society as a whole has been structured and was made to operate. These were the universals or principles of protecting life, religion, mind, property, and community. Most of you know this. These 5 universals, seen by consensus to be defining the purposes of the Sharia and constituted for serving the best interests of the believers, لِمَصَالِحِ الْعِبَادِ, as some jurists said, emerge in jurisprudence as the result of a preeminently inductive project, whereby after the Sharia has reached a level of maturity, the jurists looked back at the whole picture, so to speak, at the whole Sharia and the way it developed in 6 centuries of time, and culled these universals from the full range of legal culture, not limiting themselves to the text of revelation or the rational methods of legal theory. This, meaning usul fiqh, This, looking back, started its modest beginning in the 5th century. And of course, as some of you know, Shatibi was responsible for this. But my point here, and I would like to, I don't want to tire you any further, is to emphasize this, that many people take the 5 universals to be of value separately most of the time. Almost always we talk about them separately. If we talk about Islamic economics, it becomes about al-mal, the category of property. And so everything revolves around that one. But actually, if you think about them in totality as 5 principles, large principles that have links and interrelations and inner relations with each other, realize that they are extremely tied in extremely strong ways through concepts of ethics. Now, a final cautionary remark. For those who see in this account an idealist bent, taking it to say that Muslim societies across centuries of history were ethical through and through, every time and every place, well, this is not what I'm saying. The system I have described and will continue to describe over the next 2 weeks, is one that set a benchmark, an ethical benchmark from which it did not waver. The benchmark does not mean that everyone who was naturally ethical and conformed to an ethical conduct. We all know that there is no such thing in reality. But there was an unrelenting insistence on a Shari'i benchmark that constituted a systematic and systemic pressure to conform as much as possible to the ethical standards prescribed. So it is the ethical standards that ultimately matter. Again, I need not remind anyone that such standards have disappeared with our modernity. Again, I need not remind anyone of the effects of a world with no such benchmark, whether we talk about the devastations we wrought on the environment or our social structures, on each other and on our own selves. So, with this optimistic note, I declare my lecture complete. I really don't want to depress you, but it's, if you want to do real scholarship and real research, scholarship and research are projects of responsibility, and one has to. It's not a luxury or just a nice job. There is a lot to do through scholarship in terms of remedying and solving the problems we are encountering, and this is what I'm trying to do in my own way.
I will invite you to sit over here for questions. Yeah. You can load up your feet, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, thank you, Professor Hallaq, for another excellent lecture. It's our honor.